The, en- the engine block of the black Cadillac ticked. It was the only sound on the corner of 116th and Lenox. The air wasn't just cold, it was heavy. Heavy with the kind of silence that usually comes after a gunshot, or right before one. 3 men in trench coats stood on the sidewalk. They weren't from this neighborhood. You could tell by the cut of their lapels, by the way they checked their watches, by the way they didn't look at the buildings, but through them. They were waiting. They had been told that the city belonged to them, that the 5 families carved up New York like a Sunday roast and everyone else just ate the scraps. They believed it because they had never been told no. Not by judges, not by cops, certainly not by anyone in Harlem. But tonight, the physics of the city had changed. The streetlights flickered, casting long, jumping shadows against the brickwork. A match flared in the darkness of a doorway across the street. Just a small burst of yellow light, illuminating a hand, a cufflink, and the bottom half of a face that wasn't smiling. The smoke drifted out, gray and lazy, curling into the space between the men in the doorway. The 3 men stopped checking their watches. The leader, a man who had made his bones in Brooklyn breaking union strikes, put his hand inside his coat. He didn't pull the weapon, he just rested his hand on the leather holster. A warning, a statement. The figure in the doorway didn't move. He didn't step into the light. He just exhaled another cloud of smoke. He was watching them. Not with fear, not with anger, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a man watching an insect walk across a table, deciding whether to crush it or let it fall off the edge. The distance between the Cadillac and the doorway was less than 30 feet, but in that moment it felt like an ocean. The leader of the trio took a step forward. His shoes scraped the concrete. A violation. The figure in the doorway finally spoke. The voice wasn't loud. It was low, smooth, and sounded like gravel grinding under a heavy tire. You're 3 steps past the line. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. He didn't say what would happen if they took a 4th step. He didn't have to. The air shifted. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of eyes. From the rooftops, from the darkened windows of the brownstones, from the alleyways that looked deserted a moment ago. The 3 men realized, all at once, that they weren't the predators. They were the bait. This part of the story was never meant to be known. The police reports from that night were lost. The precinct logs were doctored. The history books will tell you the Mafia ran New York, that their power was absolute, that they went wherever they pleased. That is a lie. There was a border. There was a wall made not of brick or iron, but of will. And there was a man who understood something the mob bosses in their silk suits never could. He understood that power isn't about how many soldiers you have. It is about what you are willing to lose. Before the legend, before the suits, before the name that would make grown men whisper in social clubs, there was just the wait. Imagine waking up every morning with the ceiling pressing down on your chest. Imagine knowing that every handshake is a potential betrayal, every smile is a mask, and every corner you turn could be the last thing you see. Most men break under that pressure. They drink it away, or they run, or they fold and take orders from men who hate them. He felt it too, the fear. It was a cold knot in his stomach that never went away. He wasn't fearless. He was just better at hiding the trembling of his hands. He knew that in his world, vulnerability was a death sentence. He had watched his neighbors keep their heads down. He had watched shopkeepers pay protection money to men who laughed at them in a language they didn't understand. He saw the humiliation in his father's eyes, the quiet resignation in his mother's prayers. It burned him. It wasn't a fire that raged, it was a slow, acidic burn that ate away at the soft parts of his soul until only the iron was left. He decided very early on that he would rather be the monster in the dark than the victim in the light. He wasn't trying to be a king, he was just trying to breathe. And to breathe in Harlem, you had to make sure no one else could take your air. The room would change when he walked in. It wasn't a sudden hush, it was a gradual lowering of volume, like a radio dial being turned down by an invisible hand. The laughter would become polite, the arguments would pause, the air would get thinner. He didn't demand attention. He wore tailored suits, but they weren't flashy. No bright purples or loud checks. Charcoal, navy, black. He moved with an economy of motion, never rushing, never dragging. If he reached for a glass, it was precise. If he looked at you, he didn't scan your face. He locked onto your eyes and held them until you looked away. People didn't say his name loudly. They said, "the professor." They said, "him." They said, "the man uptown." It was a superstition almost, as if saying the name fully would summon the consequences associated with it. He sat in the back of the diners, never with his back to the door, always with a view of the street. He drank coffee, black. He played chess. And while others were playing checkers with their lives, jumping blindly over obstacles, he was thinking 10 moves ahead, sacrificing pawns to save the king, understanding that the board was bigger than just the 64 squares in front of him. He knew the Italians viewed Harlem as a cash register, a place to extract value from. He viewed it as a fortress, and a fortress needs a commander. The mistake the 3 men by the Cadillac made wasn't just geographical, it was psychological. They assumed that because they represented the syndicate, their authority carried over the border. They didn't see the eyes watching from the 3rd-floor window. A young boy, barely 12, holding a striped ball, frozen, watching the standoff below. He would grow up to tell this story, but in whispers. He saw the man in the doorway step out, just one step. The light from the street lamp caught the brim of his fedora. "Go back," the man said. It wasn't a request. The leader of the trio laughed. It was a nervous, dry sound. "We have a meeting with the numbers guys. We're here to collect." "The collection is closed." "Who says?" "The geography says." The tension ratcheted up. A car drove by 2 blocks away, its headlights sweeping across the scene, momentarily blinding everyone, creating a strobe effect of danger. In that split second of blindness, the sound of a slide racking on a pistol echoed. It came from the left, then another from the right. When the vision of the 3 men cleared, they realized the alleyway wasn't empty anymore. Figures stood in the gloom. They held shotguns, they held pipes, they held the silence. This was the line. The Mafia operated on hierarchy. They operated on structure. If a capo said go, a soldier went. They were an army. But armies struggle in guerrilla warfare. They struggle when the terrain itself fights back. The man in the fedora had not built an army. He had built an ecosystem. Every beggar, every bartender, every shoeshine boy was part of his nervous system. He knew the Italians were coming before they had even crossed 110th Street. He knew their names. He knew which one had a sick mother and which one had a gambling debt. Information was his ammunition, and he had a surplus. "You have a choice," the man in the fedora said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming almost intimate. You can turn that car around. You can go back to Mulberry Street. You can tell your boss that the traffic was bad, that you couldn't find the address. Or, he let the word hang there, suspended in the humidity. Or you can stay, but if you stay forever. The leader looked at his two aggressive subordinates. He looked at the shadows in the alleyway. He looked at the man in the doorway. He did the math. The Mafia respected strength, but more than strength, they respected the ability to do business. Dead men don't collect envelopes. There was no profit in a massacre on a Tuesday night over a collection route. It was bad for business. It brought heat. It brought cops. "We'll come back," the leader said, trying to save face. "When the boss calls you, you'll answer." The man in the doorway didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He just lit another cigarette. The flame illuminated his eyes again. They were dead calm. "The phone lines don't work up here for you." The Cadillac reversed. The gears ground together, a harsh mechanical scream in the quiet street. They turned around. They drove away, slowly at first, then speeding up as they crossed back into territory they understood. The boy in the window let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The figures in the alley melted back into the darkness. The man in the doorway waited until the taillights were gone. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He turned and walked back inside the building. But the war wasn't over. It had just been acknowledged. The mob doesn't forget, and they certainly don't forgive humiliation. They viewed this not as a defeat, but as a breach of contract, a malfunction in the machine that needed to be fixed. They didn't realize that they weren't dealing with a malfunction. They were dealing with a new design. Months passed. The city grew hotter. The summer of that year was oppressive. Asphalt softened under the sun. Tempers flared. The line held, but it was being tested. Small incursions. A bribe offered to a cop on the payroll. A shipment of heroin intercepted. A whisper campaign started in the jazz clubs. They tried to paint him as greedy, as a man who was keeping the wealth for himself. They tried to turn his own people against him. It was a classic tactic, divide and conquer. Caesar used it. Napoleon used it. Lucky Luciano used it. But he had anticipated this. He knew that loyalty isn't bought with money, it's bought with respect and protection. When a widow couldn't pay her rent, an envelope appeared under her door. No note, no demand for repayment, just cash. When a store owner was harassed by corrupt detectives, the detectives suddenly found themselves transferred to Staten Island. He didn't ask for gratitude, he asked for silence, and he got it. Harlem became a vault, and he held the combination. The real escalation came on a Sunday, a day of rest. A black sedan parked outside a church on 7th Avenue. It was empty, but the trunk was sitting low, too low. The police were called. They popped the lock. Inside wasn't a body. It was worse. It was a message. Crates of rotten fruit, melons, grapes, peaches, all decaying, covered in flies. And on top, the single dead canary. To the police, it was garbage. To the neighborhood, it was a biological hazard. But to him, reading the report later that afternoon, it was clear. "The fruit of your labor will rot," the message said, "and the bird that sings is dead." He sat in his study. The curtains were drawn. The chessboard was set in front of him. He was playing against himself. White pieces on the left, black on the right. He picked up the black knight. He turned it over in his fingers. The wood was smooth, worn down by years of thought. He understood that the Italians were done with diplomacy. The rotting fruit was a promise of decay. They were going to starve him out, cut off the supply lines, squeeze the economy of the streets until the people turned on him out of hunger. He didn't panic. Panic is a waste of energy. He planned. He knew he couldn't fight the 5 families dollar for dollar. They had unions, they had Las Vegas, they had Cuba. He had 116th Street. But he had something they didn't. He had the terrain, and he had the psychological advantage of being underestimated. They thought he was a gangster. He was a grand master. He called a meeting. Not in a back room, not in a basement. He called it in the park, in broad daylight. He sat on a bench, feeding pigeons. His lieutenants approached one by one, sitting on nearby benches, reading newspapers, pretending to be strangers. "They're going to squeeze," he said, not looking at them, tossing a crumb to a gray bird. "They're going to stop the shipments. They're going to pressure the suppliers downtown." "What do we do, Bumpy?" whispered a man 2 benches down. "We hit back?" "No," he said softly. "If you hit a swarm of bees, you get stung. You don't hit the swarm, you take away the honey." He outlined a plan that was so audacious, so risky, that it bordered on suicide. He wasn't going to fight them for control of the Harlem drug trade. He was going to give it to them, or at least make them think he had. He would pull his men back. He would let the Italians cross the line. He would let them set up shop. He would let them think they had won. "Let them come in," he said. "Let them get comfortable. Let them bring their cash. Let them bring their best men." "But—" "Silence," he commanded, his voice sharp as to cut glass. "We let them in, and when they are heavy with our gold, we close the gates." It was a Trojan horse maneuver reversed. Instead of hiding inside the horse to get into the city, he was opening the city to let the enemy in, only to trap them in a maze they didn't understand. The weeks followed. The Italian crews started moving uptown. They were suspicious at first. They expected resistance. They expected drive-bys. They expected war. Instead, they found open doors. They found corner boys stepping aside. They found the number spots unguarded. They laughed. They toasted with grappa in their social clubs in Little Italy. "He folded," they said. "The professor lost his tenure." They started moving heavy weight. They set up counting houses in Harlem tenements. They brought their nephews and their cousins to run the operations. They felt like conquerors. But they didn't notice the subtle shifts. They didn't notice that the rent on their safe houses was tripling. They didn't notice that the purity of the product they were being sold by independent suppliers was degrading, causing problems with the junkies, causing unrest in the streets that they now had to police. He was bleeding them, not with bullets, but with overhead, with bureaucracy, with chaos. He turned Harlem into a quagmire. The Italians were making money on paper, but they were losing it in operations. Trucks would break down. Shipments would go missing, not stolen, just lost. Drivers would get lost in the winding streets and end up beaten and robbed by kids who vanished into the projects. The frustration in the mob hierarchy grew. The capos were demanding envelopes, but the crews uptown were sending excuses. "It's a jungle up there," they'd say. "We can't control it." That was the lesson. You can conquer land, you cannot conquer a people who do not want to be ruled. Then came the night of the masquerade, Halloween, 1957. The Italians were hosting a private party at a club they had taken over on 125th Street. They wanted to show they were part of the community. They invited politicians. They invited judges. They wanted to legitimize their occupation. He wasn't invited, but he was there. Not inside. He was across the street, In the shadows, watching the Cadillacs pull up, watching the furs and the diamonds, he checked his watch, 11 p.m. At 11:05, the power went out. Not just in the club, on the whole block. Darkness swallowed the street, the music died, the laughter turned to confused murmuring. Inside the club, lighters flickered, voices called out for the manager. Then, a sound, not a gunshot, a drum. A single, rhythmic drum beat coming from the street. Then another, then a saxophone, wailing, mournful and angry. Then a trumpet. It wasn't a song, it was a noise, a cacophony of jazz rising from the darkness surrounding the club. The Italians, terrified of an ambush, drew their weapons in the dark. Someone fired a shot out of a window. Glass shattered. Panic. The guests screamed. They trampled each other trying to get to the exits. They spilled out into the street, into the dark, where the drumbeat was coming from everywhere and nowhere. The police arrived, but in the confusion, with the lights out, they couldn't tell who the gangsters were and who the politicians were. They started arresting everyone. They raided the club. They found the books. They found the weapons. They found the heroin stashed in the manager's office. By the time the lights came back on at 4 a.m., the Italian operation in that sector was decimated. Arrests, seizures, headlines. The peaceful occupation was a public relations disaster. He sat in a diner 10 blocks away, finishing a slice of cherry pie. The waitress refilled his coffee. "Quiet night, Professor?" she asked. "Very quiet, Martha," he replied, "just the way I like it." He had used their own weight against them. He had used the darkness. He had used the police. He had used the city itself. The Mafia bosses realized then that the cost of doing business in Harlem was too high. The tax wasn't money. The tax was chaos, and Bumpy Johnson was the tax collector. They were treated, not all at once, but slowly. They pulled back to the line. They respected the boundary again, not out of honor, but out of a pragmatic understanding that some lines are drawn in ink and some are drawn in blood, but the line at 110th Street was drawn in something harder, intelligence. The victory was silent, but the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy. The Italians had retreated back below 110th Street, licking their wounds, blaming bad luck, blaming the police, blaming the darkness. They didn't blame the man in the fedora, because to blame him was to admit that a single man in Harlem had outthought the 5 families. But war leaves debris, and sometimes the most dangerous debris isn't the enemy you defeated, but the friend who watched you do it and started doing the math. It was 3 weeks after the Halloween blackout. The rain had returned, washing the grime off the sidewalks, but making the city feel like it was sweating. He sat in the same chair, in the same study. The chessboard was still there, but this time he wasn't playing alone. Across from him sat a man he had known for 20 years, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the trenches of the numbers game, a man we'll call the Runner. The Runner was smiling. He was pouring bourbon. He was talking about the profits they were going to make now that the Italians were gone. He was talking about expansion, about taking the fight downtown, about respect. He listened. He didn't drink. He watched the Runner's hands. They were shaking, just a fraction, a micro-tremor in the fingers holding the crystal glass. "We got 'em, Bumpy," the Runner said, the ice clinking. "We really got 'em. Now we take the rest." "We don't take the rest," he said. His voice was low, barely a vibration in the room. "But they're weak. We could—" "Greed is a heavy coat. It makes you slow. It makes you drown." The Runner put the glass down. The smile faltered. "What are you saying?" I'm saying the Italians didn't just leave because of the lights going out. They left because they knew their inside man was burned. The air in the room froze. The rain tapped against the glass like 1,000 nervous fingers. The runner didn't move. He didn't reach for his gun. He knew better. In this room, you were already dead before you touched metal. "I don't know what you mean," the runner whispered. "You do," he replied. He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull a weapon. He pulled a piece of paper, a receipt, a betting slip from a club in Little Italy, dated 3 days before the Halloween raid. You were there. You were negotiating your exit. You sold them the schedule. You told them where the heroin was. You told them to bring the cash. The runner's face went gray. The betrayal wasn't about hate. It was about fear. He had bet against the house. He had looked at the mob and looked at Harlem and decided the mob couldn't lose. He was wrong. "They promised me," the runner started, his voice cracking. "They said they'd crush us. I was trying to survive." "You were trying to profit from a funeral," he said. "My funeral." Now came the choice, the escalation. In the old days, a traitor was found in the river, a message. But he wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was an architect. A dead body is a messy statement. A dead body brings police. A dead body makes a martyr. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. "You think I won because I got lucky with the lights?" he asked, his back to the traitor. "I knew you were talking to them. I let you talk to them. I fed you the schedule. I made you the bait." The runner slumped in the chair. The realization hit him harder than a bullet. He hadn't just been caught, he had been used. The information he sold to the Italians, the schedule, the location, was the trap. Bumpy had orchestrated the raid on his own club, knowing the police would find the Italians there with the goods. The traitor was the instrument of the victory. "You helped me save Harlem," he said, turning back. "Unintentionally, but you did it." "So what now?" the runner asked. "You kill me?" "No." The word hung there. "Death is too quick. And it's too loud. You're going to leave. You're going to walk out that door. You're going to go to the train station, and you're going to go west. Chicago, St. Louis, I don't care. But if you ever cross the Hudson River again, if you ever speak my name, if you ever look back." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The runner stood up. He looked small now. The expensive suit looked like a costume. He walked to the door. He paused, hand on the brass knob. "Why?" the runner asked.